Greetings, everyone. John here with a DF Retro bonus episode of sorts. Today, we're doing a bit of a podcast here where we're going to sit down with Ben Lincoln, who is responsible for creating the lostworlds.net website, which delves as deep as you could ever want into the world of Legacy of Kain and all of the games. And obviously, this episode is related to Soul Reaver, but perhaps we'll discuss all of the others as well. So, without further ado, Ben, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Ben Lincoln. As John said, years ago I created the lostworlds.net website about the Legacy of Kain series. These days I work professionally as a pen tester.
Cool.
So the work I did with Legacy of Kain kind of led into that.
Very nice, very nice. So, let's get right back to the start of it then. When did you first get into Soul Reaver? Like, what was the first version you played? When was that? I'm curious.
So it's funny, I actually knew about the deleted content from Soul Reaver before I ever played the game. I saw an article on I can't remember which website it was now, but it was the first research that anyone had done on that material, and it kind of stuck in my head. I didn't know what the terminology about the various weapons and whatnot in the game meant, but they were distinctively named, and so it stuck in my head. And maybe 6 months later, I was in a video game store with a friend of mine, looking through the used video games, and he said, "Oh, there's this game you have to play. It was basically made for you." And there was one copy of Soul Reaver in the used game bin, and it was the original PC version, so big box with lots of screenshots from the game and whatnot. It really caught my attention. And I've always been a fan of that kind of Metroid-style open world exploration game, and so I was hooked immediately.
Oh, that's cool then. So that answers the question then. PC version first. I assume then since that point you've gone back and actually played the Dreamcast and PlayStation 1 versions as well.
Yes.
So of the three then, what is your preferred way to play Soul Reaver?
Where possible, I like the Dreamcast version. It's got all of the benefits of the PC version, and it looks much nicer as well.
Very cool. So okay then, so you played the PC game after hearing that news. Then, what actually prompted you to get into starting the Lost Worlds website?
Well, I've always been fascinated by that sort of deleted material element of stories that I like, and after having played the game, I went back and reread the original research that team had done, and I felt like it was an interesting starting point, but I wanted to see what else was there. Just kind of went from there. Started taking apart the games, teaching myself what I needed to know as I went.
Oh, okay, very cool. Yeah, I've been actually using a number of the tools that you have worked on, I guess, from your website there to extract some of the data, like the texture data. I was just going through that and everything, and it's fascinating to see how it varies per system. Like, it looks like on PlayStation 1, they used, as usual, the 8-bit palletized texture format where you're using like color palettes to define textures, whereas over on Dreamcast, everything's stored in the VQ texture format with I believe all the color data is already injected into the texture data. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting having looked at those file formats. I don't know how common it is in the games industry. I know that there is a big emphasis on optimization, but what I took away from looking at the various platforms and games in the series was that the developers of the Legacy of Kain games, at least, really placed a lot of emphasis on getting right down to the metal and optimizing for the specific platform and doing everything they could in advance so that by the time they were generating the data files, it was basically the raw data that the game system itself would be using.
Yeah, that is really cool. And alongside that then, I mean, obviously the PC version shipped right after the PlayStation, and I feel like maybe at first especially it didn't fully take advantage of the platform in the same way, but on Dreamcast, they upped the frame rate to 60 frames per second, which must have required some sort of timing adjustments or something back then, because I think the PC one is capped at 30 frames per second by default. Have you messed around with uncapping that, and what are your thoughts on that kind of thing?
Oh, good question. I have not messed around with dynamically altering the PC version as much as someone like Andrew has. But I suspect that the PC version was more or less a straight port. It might even have been the dev version that was used for testing, in between compiling the PlayStation versions. I know with later games in the series, that's basically what the PC version was, and so it was kind of a no-cost thing for the company to release it. Um, but yeah, as far as I know, the Dreamcast, they put a lot of additional effort into that version. And so we're able to do some things like remaster the textures and add some polygons to models and so forth.
Yeah, actually, I was trying to look over that today, and so obviously Kain and Raziel received a significant boost in triangle count. You can tell by looking at their models, but it seems like for the most part, the environments are generally identical. Have you found that to be the case, or have you actually discovered some improvements and changes in some of the maps?
It's been so long since I played through the Dreamcast version that I couldn't tell you offhand if any of the areas had higher polygon counts. I know that the textures are all much more detailed, but it wouldn't surprise me if the environments were the same geometry. I Yeah, I know that there was a lot of effort put into those, not just because of the design themselves, but the shifting between the two planes. I don't know all of the technical details anymore, but I remember that involved a lot of kind of manual tweaking and so forth. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if they had to just leave that as is.
Yeah, it sounds like that's more like they define like I guess the coordinates of the vertices between the spectral and material plane, and then sort of interpolate between them in real time, and then sort of adjust some of the vertex colors and all that to match the alternate world. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, as far as I know, that's exactly what's going on at a sort of higher level. I know that especially on the PlayStation version, they had to do a lot of lower level tweaking of not how it appeared to the player, but how it was represented internally. So because they were right on that kind of bleeding edge of what the PlayStation could do, they had to do some tricks behind the scenes, and if they didn't construct the geometry exactly the right way, it wouldn't render correctly, even though it would look like it should have.
That is interesting. Thinking of that, I kind of, I guess I kind of learned through research here that apparently some of the older, I don't even know if this is released, but some of the older graphics files and models created for the game were actually significantly more detailed than what was in the shipping version. I'm wondering if you've actually seen any of that.
I have not, for the most part, unfortunately. So some of us did manage to do some playthroughs of pre-release versions, but they were pretty close to the release builds. There were a few things that we saw in person where there were multiple branches in hallways and whatnot, and so it was slightly more detailed. One thing I do know specifically where that was the case is one of the deleted areas. So the Undercity was constructed and worked correctly on a dev PlayStation, but because the consumer PlayStation had lower specs, it wouldn't render correctly, and unfortunately they found out too late and didn't have time to rework it. So that's why that area was pulled. And so it wouldn't surprise me if other areas of the game had similar things originally where they were more detailed and that had to be scaled back.
That is interesting. I actually did manage to get my hands on one of those early builds, just the June one for now, actually. I still need to try to track down the May build, but there's some interesting stuff in there from what I can tell, like the ability to, in the debug menu, you can do things like shift at any time and essentially give yourself all of the different powers, including some perhaps that are not in the final game.
Yeah. It's really interesting seeing that whole process. I wish with video games it were a little bit easier to kind of preserve them for fans of the series like it is with films. It's much easier to make a deleted scenes section on a DVD or Blu-ray than it is for a video game. And the games industry is so fast moving that I wouldn't be surprised if even Crystal Dynamics doesn't have those old builds of the game anymore.
Yeah, that's probably right. There's been a lot of issues with preservation of old code back then. What are your thoughts then on the future of the series then going from there? 'Cause, it doesn't seem like the series has really been on the short list for a while. I mean, there was the multiplayer game that was canceled, but it kind of seems like it's dead at this point, which is a shame.
It is. That was a fun game. I'm not normally a multiplayer fan, but I really liked the design of that one and the world they put together, and it was sad to see it go. Um, it's interesting. Different people have different perspectives on this. Ranging from kind of doom and gloom to eternal optimism. Unlike with most situations, I tend to be kind of in the middle on this, and it's interesting to me that regardless of who is in charge of the overall corporate sort of monolith that Crystal Dynamics is a part of, behind the scenes they really do keep trying to put together another game in the series, and it seems like they just have bad luck with it not turning out the way that they're hoping for. There was the single player game that Nosgoth, the multiplayer game, was descended from, and it's as far as I know, based on what Divine Shadow discovered, was pretty far along in production, and the company just kind of did a blizzard and thought, this isn't going to be as good as we'd hoped for, and we'd rather just not release it at all. But the fact that they keep trying, based on what Divine Shadow and myself and other people have found, makes me feel like, all right, there are people with an interest in making another game in the series, and they're just looking for the right kind of game to make, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I would really like to see that come to pass, because it does feel like modern technology is extremely well suited for this type of game. And there's like a certain feeling and atmosphere to it, and just, the storytelling is very different from anything else out there today. So it would be very cool to see it return. So yeah, one of the things that really sticks out to me then from the original game is that it really did seem to push the PlayStation harder than just about anything else at the time, in the sense that it was, as far as I know, the first game to implement real-time data streaming in a CD-based console game. And do you know of any others before that? Because I'm coming to blank on that, actually.
To my knowledge, it really was the first one that operated that way.
That's what I thought.
My understanding is there was a lot of skepticism that it could even be made to work, and they did some interesting tricks to make it happen.
Yeah, I'm looking into that for the video with the whole 3-room trick, where they seem to essentially load 3 of the map units at once. The room that you're in, and then the one behind you and in front of you. And as you proceed through a door, it basically removes the most distant one from memory and then starts loading in the next one, always making sure that the time it takes you to get across the room is long enough that it will have enough time to load in the next map unit.
Yeah, it's fairly common practice now, and I believe started becoming so maybe within 2 to 5 years after the game came out. I have a friend who used to be a game developer in the late 90s to mid 2000s, and I remember when that sort of shifted to becoming the model. But as far as I know, Soul Reaver was the first one that did it, at least on the PlayStation. But yeah, I could be wrong. I was not actually a PlayStation gamer at the time. I didn't become one until getting into the series.
Yeah, I think it was followed by like Metroid Prime, Soul Reaver 2. Those were actually games that did the same thing, I guess. But you're right. I think it really started to become the norm when Unreal Engine implemented it in Unreal Engine 3. Then we started to see a lot of games pick that up. Of course, Halo 2 did it as well. A lot of games were starting to use it, but Soul Reaver was definitely one of the first in that regard. And then another thing that really sticks out to me that's sort of a lost art about the game that was relatively common on the PlayStation is the way they handled the audio. Since it's all sequenced music based on samples, it's sort of a descendant from what you would hear on like the Super NES in a way, using the Sony sound chip in the PlayStation. I actually watched a video from the composer where he sort of walks through like the whole process and everything, and the sort of rendered music that he was going for, and how they eventually told him like, hey, you know what? We don't really need this kind of music anymore. You're out of date. And then that's when he was done with Crystal Dynamics.
Oh, that's really too bad. I'll have to track down that same video. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, I'll send you a link later. He gave a full presentation about it. It's like an hour long. It's really interesting to hear him discuss like the whole experience of creating the sound for the game. But yeah, it's, as you know, it's a very dynamic soundtrack because it's all generated in real time by the hardware. Though I feel like I still need to get in and test more of the PC version, but I'm not sure that it's the case on PC, is it?
For the PC version of Soul Reaver, the first Soul Reaver at least, it's all just static sound. So no dynamically sequenced music.
That's what I thought. And what about Dreamcast, actually? I couldn't really find much on that.
That's a really good question. I don't actually know offhand. The Dreamcast version has always been a little bit more challenging than the others for us to take apart the content from. The platform was not nearly as popular as the PlayStation. So, with PlayStation data files, if you can get something like that ends up being raw audio or a music sequence file for PlayStation, there's a decent chance that someone's written something that will play or view or convert it to a more standard format. But with the Dreamcast, it's much more challenging.
Yeah, that is a shame, for sure. It seems like there has been a lot of mod work going into the PC version, at least over the years. You can replace textures in it at this point, I think, and people have like inserted Bink versions of the original videos, I think, possibly ripped from either the Dreamcast version or maybe from, I think, Soul Reaver 2 or Defiance had like the ability to view higher quality versions of those original movies in real time on the system.
Yeah, I believe that's correct. There was a big effort, I want to say, around 5 years ago, and a number of people ended up kind of improving the game in various ways. And if I remember correctly, that actually led to the version that's on Good Old Games.
That's the version that I downloaded for this. Yeah, because actually until now, I really had not delved into the PC version at all. It's just for this episode. I've always been a fan of the series, but I first played it on Dreamcast, then picked up a PS1 copy, and I've mostly played those games. But the PC version is kind of a new thing for me. And it's been fascinating to see how it sort of differs now versus what it was when it was released, I guess, a month after the original PlayStation 1 version.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that would be it'd be interesting to go backwards, kind of like you have, starting with the Dreamcast version.
Yeah, and that's for the episode that this is going to be running alongside. What I'm trying to do then is basically explore all three versions and try to showcase some of the interesting tech that's going on, but then also visualize the actual differences. So I've used Model EX, for instance, to get some nice visualizations of the various models, both with textures enabled in wireframe mode and just flat shaded. Try to show people the actual tangible difference so that they can appreciate that. And it's turned up some interesting stuff for sure that I wasn't fully aware of before, and I'm enjoying that a lot. And of course, Crystal Dynamics history as well has come up with that. How much of their history as a company have you explored? Because I was very familiar with many of the games they produced, but I didn't realize just how many games they made in like 5 years. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, they were very prolific. I have researched the history of the company as a whole a little bit, mostly kind of trying to piece together the file formats and whatnot. When I was really heavily into the reverse engineering, I figured, well, I've got this tool that will extract content from Soul Reaver and so forth. Can I make it work with other Crystal Dynamics games? And so I looked into the ones that came before and after, and learned a bit about them at the time. And there were definitely some that I picked up as well, and just had fun with his games.
Did you actually manage to extract any data from them?
Typically, with the games that came out within a couple of years of Soul Reaver, I was able to at least extract raw data from the PlayStation or PlayStation 2 versions of the games. I didn't put a lot of effort into doing anything useful with it. If it was in the same kind of format as the Kain games, then there's a good chance that the same tools would work. But because they did tweak things so heavily to make them run as well as possible, it's also very likely that someone else would have to step in and make a converter.
So yeah, that's an interesting tidbit that I learned while chatting with some other guys about that have been examining the game through the years. One of the interesting things that came up there revolves around the development environment used to create the game. Soul Reaver was built using what was called the SciQ development system, which a lot of other PlayStation titles use as well, of course. But in this case, it seems likely that the SciQ libraries also made their way over to the PC and Dreamcast, which was certainly not very common. But really, what's interesting about the whole SciQ thing is that it was built by SN Systems, but published by Psygnosis back in the day. And obviously, Sony bought up Psygnosis, and through them, they were introduced to SN Systems' product, which they were so impressed by that they ended up scrapping their own workstation plans in favor of SciQ.
Yeah, that is really, really interesting. I'll have to do some more reading about that. Yeah, I know a bit about the kind of the descendants and ancestors of the Soul Reaver engine within Crystal Dynamics, but not sort of external influences like that. That is really interesting.
Actually, while we're on it then, what do you know about the engines that followed? I'm kind of interested in that as well. Like, where did they go from Soul Reaver to future games?
So Soul Reaver itself is descended from a couple of internal engines at Crystal Dynamics. It's called the Gex engine because that was one of the primary games that it came from. And you'll also see that in titles that came out right before it, like Akuji. They ended up using it in a number of other titles that they produced. So Soul Reaver 2 uses a descendant of it. They were even using it as recently as when Crystal Dynamics took over the Tomb Raider games. So a very many steps involved descendant of the original Gex engine at that point, but still using a lot of the same things internally. Of course, the graphics and whatnot, subsystems had been greatly overhauled by then, but you could definitely see a common thread between them. I don't know if they're still using that for the modern Tomb Raider games, but it wouldn't surprise me. It's a fairly flexible design. Yeah, there was a side branch with Blood Omen 2, which used an engine that had been put together for Mad Dash Racing, and I think that ended up being kind of a one-off. I don't know.
That was not a great engine from what I remember.
Interesting.
It did not run well.
Anything in particular that stands out for you?
Yeah, so Soul Reaver 2 and Defiance they both run at a perfect 60 frames per second on the target platforms. So Soul Reaver 2 on PS2 and then Defiance on both the Xbox and the PlayStation 2. Whereas Blood Omen 2 is an extremely unstable game, especially on PlayStation 2. It aims for 60 frames per second, but most of the time it falls very short, and so you end up with a very sort of a fluctuating frame rate that's just really unsteady. And beyond that, I just found like it just felt more chopped up, and the animation system seemed less fluid, and the overall game just kind of felt jerky compared to what they were doing with Soul Reaver, despite being released later.
Interesting. Yeah, I've noticed a few of those things. I don't catch as many frame rate differences with my eye as some folks do. But that would make a lot of sense. I know that was a slightly troubled title, and so I'm not surprised it was a one-off. But yeah, it could very well be that they're still using some descendant of that engine, even for the modern Tomb Raider games.
So thinking of then going back to Soul Reaver, we know that Soul Reaver 1 hit the Dreamcast, and there was a point when it was also planned to release Soul Reaver 2 on Dreamcast and the PlayStation 2. And I'm wondering if you've ever actually seen any sort of build or anything really from the Dreamcast iteration of the game.
I have not seen that, unfortunately. Yeah, that would be very interesting.
Yeah, I'd really like to know what was going, if it's even possible to have run that at a full frame rate, because I know even Soul Reaver 1 sort of struggles with the performance in some of the larger areas on there, whereas Soul Reaver 2 is a locked 60 frames per second on the PlayStation 2 with much higher geometry count in the environment, and just, it's a much more richly detailed game. So I would have been curious to see if they could actually pull it off on Dreamcast, but there's just not a lot of information out there as far as I can tell.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me at all if, and I have very little, if any, evidence to support this, but that they had done that Dreamcast build of Soul Reaver as kind of a lead-in to beginning work on Soul Reaver 2 with the Dreamcast in mind, and then when the Dreamcast ended up not doing as well as some people had hoped, that combined with them realizing what you're saying, that the technical capabilities of the Dreamcast might have been pushed beyond their limits, making it, they just went ahead and shifted platforms. I've never seen really any sort of in-person solid information about the Dreamcast version. I have a few screenshots, but no in-person builds or anything. That would be very, very interesting to see.
All right. Is anything else that sticks out in your mind that's worth mentioning while we're here?
No, I can't think of anything offhand.
Okay, so I think that about wraps it up for this quick bonus podcast episode here, and hopefully you will find something interesting and enjoyable in here. And of course, I want to give a big thanks to Ben for coming out and joining me all the way from, I guess, the central time zone in the U.S.
No, thank you. It's been a lot of fun. I'll look forward to seeing the final product.
Excellent. Well, I think that's going to do it for this episode. And hopefully we'll be able to bring you more of these sort of bonus pieces as well, alongside the typical DF Retro episodes. And of course, if you haven't had a chance to check out the full episode, be sure to give that a watch. But that's all for now. If you enjoyed this one, be sure to let me know over on Twitter at Dark1X. And until next time, stay retro.